Hello and good evening. I am Sarah Stevens. My friends call me Sally. I'm sorry, I am Sarah Stallings. My friend is called Sarah Stevens, and I said her name right out, didn't I? Well, anyway, I am Sarah Stallings, and my friends call me Sally, so y'all can call me Sally. Now, I was born in 1808 in the western part of Johnston County, and I married my beloved beau, Isaac Stallings, and we had 6 children. And we were raising those children on his big plantation. We had orchards and we had all kinds of crops and stuff, and as well as the children. And we were doing quite well, and because we lived, they had made the stagecoach line go right through our property. So when the people would get off the stagecoach, we just opened up our house and turned it into a little inn, and people would come and stay in our inn there. So we were doing pretty good with money-wise. Well, then in 1854, he went up and left me because he died. But he left me with them 6 youngins to raise. So I had to do a pretty good job of figuring out how to make all that land work for me. Well, one day a man came into the parlor and he said, "Miss Sarah," actually he called me Miss Stallings because I didn't know who he was. Come to find out, he was from the North Carolina Railroad Company. And he said that they were going to build a railroad from, the stagecoach went from New Bern to Charlotte. And they were going to build the railroad was going to go from Goldsboro to Charlotte. And so I didn't hardly know what a railroad was, but anyway, he was trying to tell me about 2 tracks and a big engine thing coming flying on it. So anyway, that's what we decided to, he wanted to know if I would participate by giving them or selling them some of my land. Well, I decided to sell it instead of give it. So I called in all my neighbors and I said, they're going to need a piece of your land too, if they're going to make this thing work. So we all decided to sell some of our property to the railroad. Well, it took a long time for that railroad. This was about 1848, and Mr. Isaac had died in 1843. So it took a long time for them to get that, before we heard the hammer against the tracks. But we finally did, and finally in 1854, the railroad was completed in our area. And then I knew we were going to have those railroad folks, the passengers on that train, were going to be a lot more than 3 times a week with the stagecoach going through, and they were going to have to come and stay somewhere. So my son-in-law, William Sanders, built a hotel right across the street on a piece of my property, so they just had to walk off the street and right into our hotel. Well, then Mr. Jewel Nichols and Mr. W.W. Cox said they wanted to buy an acre of land from me. And I said, well, I'm not going to sell it to you at $1 or $2 an acre, which is what we usually get for farmland, but I will sell it to you for $100. I thought they were going to have stroke, but they bought that piece and it was real good for them, and they opened up a dry goods store and a grocery store. Now, Mr. James Brighton was managing the station there beside the train. Did I mention that I sold that land to the railroad to put that station on? And I convinced them they might use some of my good pine trees to run the train, because we had to have quick, hot heat to heat the water. That it was a steam engine train. So they were buying my land, buying my trees all around, and my neighbors' trees. Well, those trees were also good for sap that turned into turpentine, and that was our biggest cash crop back in the 1850s or so. Well, Mr. Troy Bunn came to me and he wanted to buy a piece of land to do a turpentine distillery. And I said, well, that makes sense. We won't have to haul that stuff off with our carriages and all that. So that worked out really good. Well, then y'all know Wesley Hughes. Well, he came to me and he said, Sarah, we have got to have us a watering hole at that train station. I said, well, Wesley, I don't know if that's legal. He said, well, we just got to have us one. So I sold him an acre of land. He built a watering hole. I think y'all call it a bar now. Well, that turned out to be real good too. And so, but then I was feeling a little bit guilty because they had named the station after my husband, my late husband, Mr. Stallings. And because they thought I was going to give them the land, but I didn't. Anyway, so then I was feeling a little bit guilty about our children. They needed some education. So Mr. William Jones came back. He had been off at Brown University getting some kind of education. He came back as a professor, and he bought another piece of land for me, and we put up the first 2-story brick building in the western part of the county. There was 2 here, the jail and the courthouse here in Smithfield, but we didn't have anything up there like that then in the western part of the county. So in Stallings Station, we built a building, and they Oh, it was wonderful. We not only had a little dormitory for the students and the teachers, and we only charged them $6 a month to stay because students had to drive in from a far away or walk in from a far away. Well, we had plays and speeches, and I understand that building is still there, parts of it, and they call it something about the center now, and they do all kinds of plays and stuff there, in downtown Clayton. So anyway, I was getting older in my 50s, and now I was going to have to. My sons wanted me to move me to Arkansas, and we did. And I never got to go back to my beloved Stalin Station. I died in January of 1869, and in April of 1869, they named my Stalin Station Clayton, North Carolina, after the post office and after the school there that Mr. Johnson started. It's been so wonderful to have y'all with me tonight, and y'all can call me Sally because you're my friends.
Thank you.
Good evening, folks. My name's Mary, but I'm called Polly. See, I was born in the country not far from here in the 1830s. I was what they called a free issue. See, I was never enslaved, but the sheriff took me away from my mother when I was just a little girl. Because the county court could do that when you were poor or fatherless like me and my sister Piety. We were bound out to Sheriff Ballinger here in Smithfield. And I stayed and worked with them until I was grown and had a child of my own. And then this big, tall, dashing man came into town and swept me off my feet. His name was Brian Alfred, and he was a free issue like me. We got married and bought a couple lots over on 3rd Street. We stayed in this little town for the rest of our days. Now, we were tempted to try greener pastures, but this was always home. See, Dr. Beckwith and Mr. Schneider helped Bryant get started in the cotton ginning and sawmilling business. This was in 1861, a few months before the Southern soldiers marched off to fight the Yankees. Bryant did right well. After the war, he had the only store where you get the fancy groceries, like cakes, candies, fruits, nuts, wines, that sort of thing. After the war, Bryant built a little hotel and a cafe. Bryant was right smart and ambitious. In fact, if you check the records, you'll see that he was the wealthiest man in town. That's right. The wealthiest man in town was a man of color, and he was my husband. He even got elected mayor once. Now, that didn't sit too well with some folks. One night, there was a mysterious fire in the gin house. Burned up half the town, including our house, a barn, the mill, and even the county jail. Then a few years later, Bryant built a new saloon and store, and that too got burned up. They arrested a woman for setting the fires, but I always wondered who was really responsible. Well, Brian Alfred didn't let a little fire get him down. He just rebuilt and kept it going. See, the funny thing is, neither one of us ever learned how to read or write. Bryant made a little B when he signed his name, and I made an X when I signed mine. Now, we couldn't read or write, but we could count some money, honey. We weren't going to get cheated, no sir. See, when the railroad came into town in the 1880s, this little town started coming to life. It got pretty busy. It got so busy that Brian had to put his little B on a piece of paper and make me a free trader. That meant I could buy and sell things and run the cafe when he wasn't there. Now, I know it sounds silly, but that's the way the law was back then. Women just didn't have many rights like they do today. Shucks, we couldn't even vote for the dog catcher. See, Bryant was a good carpenter. So good that he built several buildings in town. One of his buildings was at the corner of 3rd and Johnston. I think there's a movie theater there today. Now, there's only one of his buildings left today, and it's on 3rd Street. And I'm told it's in the process of being fixed up. Now, I put all those other buildings to the side. The building Bryant was most proud of was the covered bridge over the Neuse River. You see, at the end of the war, some Southern soldiers burnt down the old bridge to slow the Yankee army down as they came into town. Well, Brian Alfred was the hero of Johnston County when he finished that bridge. Bryant was known for his bridge, I guess I was known for pleasing the taste buds of folks who came to my restaurant. Now, I do have to say this. I found it awful funny when people used to come in and call me Aunt Polly, especially when we was no kid. Well, I see things have changed for the better, and I know it's for the best. Well, I hope y'all have fun listening to me, and I've had fun talking to y'all. Y'all have a nice night.
Good evening. My name is Robert Franklin Smith. Folks call me Bob. I grew up on a farm in the Meadow community, but I was too adventurous to stay there. I tried my hand at teaching school, but discovered I had an entrepreneurial spirit. I like to build things, repair things, and make money. I was also one of the first in these parts to sit astride a bicycle. Now that may not seem like a great accomplishment to you good people, but in my day the roads of Johnston County were much different. Of course, all we had were dirt roads, and they were not well maintained. Horses and mules were what we had to get around. The roads were always washed out. Deep sand or hard-rutted clay when it was dry, and always the dust. In wet weather, deep mud holes and a soupy mess was what we had. Towns and cities like Smithfield were even worse, with the heavy commercial traffic and the leavings of the horses and the mules churned in. It was always a right smart mess. I was always eager to try the next new thing, but when I learned of a new method of getting around on wheels without a horse, I couldn't believe it. They came from Europe, and they were becoming all the rage in our northern cities. Newspapers and magazines like Harper's ran regular stories of adventurers and their exploits with this amazing invention. In 1884, a man named Stevens rode all the way from San Francisco to Boston on a machine just like this one in 104 days. Remarkable. I saw my first bicycle like we saw lots of things back in the day, at the State Fair in Raleigh. They had a demonstration team there performing for the crowds. It was like magic, and I was completely caught up in it. They had these machines for sale there too. They cost nearly $100, which was a fortune in that day. I scraped up the money though, and I soon bought one for myself. I found it takes a bit of courage to mount the first time, but you soon get used to it. It's surprisingly stable once you're aboard and moving, but unnerving and quite dangerous all the same. Riders of the wheel were also the height of fashion. We showed off our expensive machines to the amazed passerby. We glided by effortlessly, high above the average man, or so it seemed. In reality, it was a great deal of effort. Under the best of conditions, you could spend a good third of your trip walking your bicycle through the aforementioned sand, mud, and other hazards. Occasionally, you had to pick yourself out of a ditch, too. I pushed on in the name of glory and adventure. Besides, it was way better than fighting with a mule. It was only natural that a fashionable and single man would utilize this sophisticated mode of transport when he went to call on a special lady friend. Miss Myrtle Weeks had caught my eye while I was teaching school just down the street at the Turlington Institute. I made many a trip to visit her in the Polenta section about 12 miles west of here. It must have been difficult to resist a fashionable rider of the wheel because she soon became my wife. We moved to Benson and I opened my own bicycle shop, then a funeral parlor that yet exists. Later on, I established a building supplies manufacturing firm that became one of the largest employers in Johnston County. I bought Myrtle the finest house on Main Street in Benson at the height of the Great Depression. Bicycling became increasingly popular. Bicycle clubs like the League of American Wheelmen began the Good Roads movement and pushed for better public roadways across the country. Improvements in bicycle technology were used to develop the automobile and even aircraft. Perhaps you can even name two fellow bicycle shop owners from Ohio who brought their inventions to the beaches of Kitty Hawk here in North Carolina. I hope you remember to share the roadways with cyclists and appreciate a bit more of the history of these amazing machines. Please mind your step as you continue your journey.
Thank you. Thank you. And there is a fire ant hill right behind the lady with the picture.
Fill in this way.
Yeah,
And if-
the fire ants were over there.
Over on that side.
Okay.
Okay.
I think
I see it.
we can find this already.
Yep, now if y'all look, just over there by the tree line, there's 3 crosses. The furthest one is my grave. Hello, I am Edwin Smith Pugh. I was born here in Smithfield a little over 125 years ago. I guess you could say I lived a charmed life. When I was a toddler, my father was elected to the U.S. Congress. So my world is a little bit bigger than maybe some people's around here in Smithfield. But we celebrated Christmas just like everyone else, and the way we would celebrate is cut down a big old holly tree, and at the end of the long branches, we would have candles on. Well, I got an idea that it might be fun for a little bit of target practice to aim for the candle on top. So I went across the street to the Tuscarora Hotel, up in the attic. I took aim, got it, first shot. But what I hadn't planned on was that candle falling, lighting the tree on fire, and Santa with his beard and cotton fixins on his coat. But, oof, I was nervous, but luckily the bucket brigade came and we put that fire out, and no one was the wiser that it was me who had knocked over that candle, other than my best friend who kept that secret for me. And well, when I graduated from the Turlington Graded School, I went off to the University of North Carolina up in Chapel Hill. But I was adventurous, a little bit of a restless soul, and my dad needed a secretary up in Washington to help him with all that correspondence. So I transferred to George Washington University, and I enlisted. And I went after we received a certain telegram from the Germans to the Mexicans down to Mexico. Turns out they were trying to strike a deal to give back territory that we'd won. So nothing came of that. I went back to Washington, and I leaned on my daddy because I wanted to fly. So he felt around some of his connections, and he got me situated with the British Royal Flying School up in Toronto, Canada. It was the first time I'd been outside the country. I passed flying colors, of course, and I came back home so I could marry my sweetheart, Miss Margaret Roberts. Now, my parents were very surprised. Oh boy, they were. I went over, unfortunately, with a few weeks left in the war. I bombed 2 submarines and destroyed a mine. Unfortunately, when I was landing the seaplane, there was a buoy sticking up out of the water that I struck. And my 2 passengers survived, one of them without a scratch, but I passed. I was buried in France for 2 years before I was sent here home. And Woodrow Wilson awarded me the Navy Cross posthumously. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Donnell Nairn, and I want to tell you about an amazing machine that helped us win the war. I'm talking about the Second World War, and it was the B-25 bomber plane. Now, some of those planes just had 1 pilot, but I flew the J model, and there were 2 pilots and 2 control panels. I kind of like to have them backup, because you never know what you're going to see up in the wild blue yonder. Anyway, it was towards the end of the war, and I completed 37 bombing missions. We were bombing bridges in Italy whenever we took a hit. And we could tell the plane was going to crash, so we bailed out just like we'd been trained to do. Luckily, our parachutes were working that night, and we landed safely on the ground somewhere in northern Italy. That was March 20th, 1945. We spent a couple of days hiding, hoping and praying that the Nazis wouldn't catch up with us. To pass the time, we talked about our families and what we would do whenever we got back home. I told them about my widowed papa and my little brother Tommy, who were back home in North Carolina in Kinley. I also told them about my twin sister Louise and my other sisters, and how I love to tease them, and also how hard we worked barring tobacco. I sure did miss my family, and I'm pretty sure they were missing me too, especially Tommy and Papa, because they had a lot of extra work to do in the yard and in the barn, with me and my brothers being off at war. So after a couple days of hiding, our worst fears were realized and the Nazis caught up with us. They took us to a country jail. Their goal was to torture us and try and get military secrets out. They did not, but that's all I'm going to say about that. Just a day after we'd been captured, they took me and 3 other Americans and 2 British soldiers out in a car. They stopped and told us to get out. Pretty soon after that, my days on this earth were over. They shot us right there. It went totally against the Geneva Connection rules, but they were Nazis and they just didn't care. My papa got a telegram about a week later saying that I was missing in action. All the Army knew was that our plane crashed and that we parachuted out. For several months, my family agonized not knowing what had happened to me. It was July whenever he finally got the telegram. I can only imagine how much it must have hit him and Tommy to lose a son and a brother at 22. The story has an epilogue, though. Those Nazis who killed me were tried for war crimes and hanged. I guess that gave my family some closure, but the fact is that war is cruel and that innocent people suffer on both sides. If I would ask one thing of you good people tonight, it would be that you would embrace and enjoy the freedoms that so many of us lay down our lives for. Live life to the fullest, and please don't take freedom for granted. And with that, I say goodnight.
Thank you.